I'm going to show you, first of all, the handout that is available. And if you did not receive a handout, you can get one from me today by just doing the my email, and I'll be happy to send that to you. Janny T2162@gmail.com. It's about 8 or 9 pages long because I have put 3 death certificates in for you so that you have some practice materials. So here's a partial certificate of death for my grandpa. I've got one, I think, right at the beginning, maybe. Yep, there's my mom. You can use hers. And then at the very end, I have one for my uncle, Orrin. So there are 3 pieces of practice materials in here today for you. So enough said about that handout. And what I will do now is, hopefully, I will go back down again and find yeah, I will. Oh, there we are. And find go to share. And I am going this time to go to the presentation. And Cheryl, if you cannot hear this or it's not advancing, I would appreciate a phone call to Dennis if you could. Or maybe, well, I've got my phone over here someplace and maybe we can try that if we have a problem. I'm going to the total slideshow using a scaffold question strategy to get the best data and information from a death certificate. This is a reading skill and an analysis skill that we actually, we teach the beginnings of this beginning with 3rd graders and advance with it actually through the grade levels. It's something that adults might not think of as a strategy, but it works. And scaffolds are very interesting in and of themselves in the first place. We're going to apply a scaffold of the questions. And Cheryl, I should be on the 2nd page of this. We're going to learn to apply a scaffold, and a scaffold is a means for people to help you to get the ultimate help at the beginning and then to be able to back off on that help once you use something strategically and, need I say, all of the time. You've got to pre-plan to use it, or else you're going to miss great information. Plan before you focus, because what happens when we get a death certificate? Well, we all do the Snoopy dance immediately because we're happy that we got it. And we look for that 1 or 2 pieces of information that clue us into things that we just had to have about our grandpa or our great grandpa or a great aunt or someone in our family who has kind of disappeared into the background. If you want to get the good stuff on any certificate or frankly on any kind of official document, you have to have a process that helps you to utilize all of it. Otherwise, you're seriously going to miss lots of good information. You will be the person at that point who is just looking for the next small piece of information rather than being able to connect with valuable information that lets you formulate your next question. We've all done it. We've all missed valuable data because we did not activate the things that we know best to do to make sure that we've got what we need and we can proceed independently. This is going to help you to break down all of those brick walls, hopefully. Any certificate or document provides the means to get to another piece of information, but you really have to be clued in. That means that if you're a good historian or a good genealogist, what you're looking for is you want to add totally to your experiences and your background information, not just add another piece of information. A death certificate is a rather simple device for us today, although I will tell you, death certificates can be quite complicated. They provide a chance for us, if we ask the right questions, and if we take the time to provide answers that we can see, and if we analyze, it's going to guide us to more information immediately. I hope you want just more than the death date and the place and the person's middle name or whatever. Hopefully you want a way to fill out a person's life sketch. And for that, a death certificate by itself is prime information. Toward the end, I'll try to remember to talk about when you cannot find a death certificate and what kinds of informal types of information might help you with that. At least you can use them as a supporting piece of evidence. Remember, you're going to want to use these because they break down your knowledge barriers. Our goals, first of all, today I'm hoping that we're going to gain some needed information on some death certificates we see, and we're going to learn a genealogy master skill set, the questions scaffold. So you're going to learn to use a question scaffold to get the most data from a certificate. I want you to recognize that it will be the most data you can at this point in your ability to analyze something. Because if you take the time to go back later when you are better at analyzing, you're going to discover that you not only find more information that you missed, but you'll even ask some different kinds of questions that show you how to go deeper, not just in the particular set of information you're looking at on a certificate, but to go deeper and look for the next set of information that you are going to probably find. If you don't, you're going to just regard a certificate as an endpoint, and that's a pity. Our death certificates aren't just full of information, they're full of questions. Those questions are hidden, but each piece of information in a certificate, of course, it answers a question. You have to ask that question. Remember that states and countries use these questions and pieces of information as a mean to aggregate health information, build health strategies based on that information, build information on the status of various kinds of diseases, and so on. So when you see a state or a country change its particular death certificate, that wasn't up to just one person. That usually had to go through some type of legislature, and that means it's a good clue to you to go back and look at the state's new definition of a death certificate or a new definition of things that are demanded as a result of more information being needed. It will have gone through legislature, at least for a review. And sometimes legislatures modify the death certificate information. We ran into this not long ago when we were working with some certificates in the late 1970s. In Montana, they changed the definition of death, and for an entire year, doctors were very reluctant to supply very much information about how the person died. In fact, sometimes those things were left totally blank until they got some good information and had talked to one another about what they dared to put down. That tells me, and it should tell you, that you should audition the questions before you ever get a certificate. So let's just think on this. So you've sent off for a death certificate, or if you're fortunate, you've gone down and just been able to receive the death certificate, and you are anxious to receive information about a particular item that is there. And then you find out that the information isn't there that you wanted, and you just say, doggone. And hopefully you don't throw it away. Hopefully you don't put it down. hopefully you look at the form even more closely because there's lots of other information there for you to get information from. Let's talk about that scaffold again and how you can use it as an analysis strategy, because we're not just using it for a simple answer. We are using it to get a little more sophisticated in terms of the questions we ask about the information on the death certificate, and as a way to help us lead to another piece of information we want. Remember, the active supports here are going to be the questions that help you move to complete mastery of that death certificate. And yes, I'm talking about one death certificate at a time. Your goal, of course, is eventual autonomy. When you're using this skill and you're in a county courthouse someplace and you've obtained a document, a death certificate, hopefully you are going to whip out at least some cards and use this skill so that you don't miss things on there. Please don't just promise that you are going to do this later, because you'll forget. And it takes time, it takes practice, it takes dedication to master a skill set. And how will you know it's mastered? Well, it isn't mastered until this kind of process is second nature for you or automatic in the things that you do as you look at any document. You know, this can also help you in terms of looking at things like tax preparation, all kinds of things, because you look at the questions differently in terms, rather than just looking and saying, what information do I need here? Strategic questions then are the ultimate. Well, they're those same old things that teachers taught you a long time ago. Who, what, when, where, why, how, and extensions of those questions. They become a framework and a scaffold if you use them all of the time. You're going to be able to get the information you need. You're going to be able to analyze all of the information on the certificate because you're giving yourself time to look at that and saying, wow, I need to take time to look at all of this, not just one piece of information. It's going to help you to eventually be able to self-direct to more information rather than coming to someone else and saying, well, I got the death certificate. What next should I get? It's not just the death certificate. You've got a whole pile of information there that is extremely valuable that you're going to need to put various places in your databases and in your timelines so that you can write a conclusion that your family will understand about that person. You should be able to write a brief summary about that person and the death as a result of the information you find. When I'm looking at a death certificate, I'm letting you see a screen here that says I prefer to use 2 sheets of paper behind the death certificate. And so I've got 2 17-inch sheets of paper here, and I would put them side by side and tape them delicately, but so that you'll be able to fold them later on, because they're going to become a valuable piece of information for you to look back at. And then we're going to place a copy of the death certificate we're using. Please don't use your original. Make a copy, put that in there, lightly tape it down. We'll take a look a little more at what this looks like. But this gives us the opportunity then to formulate all the questions we want to formulate about the information on the death certificate. And it provides a nice little self-check for you, because if you get done and you've only put 3 or 4 questions down, then you're not done yet. And you need to self-direct to finish that, because insights are going to come to you as you begin to put this information together. So choose your method, but write the questions and don't think you know them in general. When I learned this technique, I used 3-inch by 5-inch cards because I wanted to write down all the who questions possible on one card. By the way, it's not possible, but you know, I could say, who is this? Who are they related to? Who's their wife? Who's their husband? Whatever. And I put all of the who type of questions I thought might be on a death certificate on one card. Because remember, each state does a different thing with their death certificate based on the definition of death in their state and what has been anticipated that will be needed for national reports too. So all my what question types go on a card. All my where and when question types go on one card together. How questions can go on a card. I'm just interested in saying that I want to be able to pick out some things I should be usually using instead of getting to the death certificate and saying, whoa, who is all over. The who questions are all over on this sheet. So what should I do? That's why you have a death certificate taped lightly in the center portion of a larger sheet of paper so that you can draw your who questions and draw them to the place that answers it for you. It's going to help you too, so that you know that you've got the right kind of question answering that material. It worked for me because it makes me force myself to go through each set as I look at a death certificate. And that's a real important thing. I can tell you that once you get good at this, you're going to spend at the max 20 minutes. And 20 minutes isn't too long for you to do this. It really isn't. You're just going to become a little better each time because your questions will change based on the person and based on the information you see. So I tell people, please take time to write down all the different kinds of who questions you think you've seen on a death certificate and all the what questions and all the where and whens, because you don't want to be lost saying, what should I do on this next thing? I have had people walk up beside me at a courthouse, take one look at my question card and ask if I could make a card for them. My answer is no. I'll let you see my questions and you can write one for yourself. I don't care if you put them on a sheet of paper or whatever, but they are a nice pre-planning set of things to do before you get started with any document. So you're going to anticipate the who questions. The who questions are those about the decedent, the person who died, his or her informant. I always want to look for that and make sure that I get that down. And the address of that informant, his or her doctor or medical person of record, the funeral home director, because later on you're going to want to say, did anyone else in the family use this same funeral home or one that went on from here? His or her partner, even if they were divorced, or anyone that you suspect from looking at from the informant lived with him or her. You also have to think a little bit in your mind when you don't get a lot of answers about who is not on the certificate, but they may have answers you want. That's that fan club. So down at the very bottom of that 11 by 17 sheet of paper, or those two pasted together, you are going to want to say, contact Aunt Mabel, contact Dick and Mickey who lived next door and I met them once, or whatever. And who might have written the obit? Remember, families usually write or they provide the information for an obituary. You're going to want to find that. And it could be totally different again. I'll warn you in terms of what it says the person died of, if it does say that. So here's my mom with some who questions here. She's deceased. Her name is Inez G. Lee. And her date of death was August 24. She was 65 when she died. Yeah, very young. My dad died when he was 57. In Polson at St. Joseph's Hospital. It says she's divorced. Didn't put my dad down, but at least I've got a valuable clue there to go after that divorce. She was a registered nurse. The next who are the parents. Who are her parents? Well, Engvald B. Beck, and her mom was Ella Mae Bennett, identified so by her maiden name. And the person, the informant filling it out, is this person called Mary Fulkerson. And fortunately, I know that's my sister, Susie. Yes, I know her name is Mary, but we've all called her Susie. The next kind of who questions are down at the bottom. Who was her doctor? Uh, where was this? The funeral home. And who was the register who signed it? Because you may want to go back after more information. Now, let me tell you, I did want to go back after more information because I discovered my mom had 2 death certificates, and I got the first one, which had only her name filled in and her address. Because when it was sent down from St. Joseph's Hospital, nobody would sign off on that at the hospital because my mom chose and said that if she had a stroke, they were just to let her be. They were not to try any efforts to try to save her life. It was a Catholic hospital. And so later on, my sister, who worked for the county at one point in Lake, went back, and there were 2. Earl Coryell had done his job and he had signed off on that. So I was very grateful to get that. This is a very full certificate of death from the 1970s in Montana. This is prior to the time that Montana wrote a new definition of death. And you'll notice that there were immediate causes and consequences and so on that are in there. And there's a lot of other information which could be filled in about other significant conditions. I want you to note those because they provide some information to you about what happens when you've got a death certificate that has very little information on it. You need to be asking questions about where that information is in reality, and would there be more information on more documents. In Montana, for example, if a person enters a hospital and dies within 24 hours of entrance, then there needs to be at least a check by the coroner of record as to what happened during that time. It doesn't mean that there will be necessarily a long coroner record or an inquest. Those are 2 different things, but you will see that someone signed off in a coroner's office or the sheriff's office or whatever, whoever was there, saying that certification was done by the coroner. If you look down on the left side, there is a portion there called the certifier. It says certification coroner on the basis of the examination of the body and or the investigation. In my opinion, death occurred, blah, 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 kind of thing. When you don't see that, you know that the person also, a piece of valuable information, has been in that hospital for more than 1 day. So you're going to anticipate the when and where questions you need to ask yourself. These will be demographics. When was the death? How long had the person been living in that area? You'll find the questions about or answers to the question about how long they had been in a certain area in the 40s, 50s, and 60s in Montana. Sometimes it's not been abandoned at all. Where did the person normally live? Is that where they died? How long had they been in an institution? Was it a hospital? Was it a nursing home? Did they die at a hotel? I mean, we have a fella in town here who tells great stories, wonderful stories about Great Falls history. And he tells the story of a banking president of some note back more near the turn of the 19th century than the 20th. This person died in about like 1908 or 1909. And what happened is that person did not die at home and did not die at the bank. In fact, that person died while visiting, well, maybe kind of a girlfriend, and he was married. And to make a long story short, yes, it tells the address on the death. It does not tell you that in order to get that body down and out of there, they use the laundry chute. But that's a story for another time. So you'll see a certificate of death here for my grandfather, Oscar L. Lee, who was driving and almost over the Continental Divide on US Highway 2 when he suffered a heart attack, massive coronary occlusion, they think, and his car, being that it was wintertime on December 23 of 62, he dived into the snowbank on the side where there's the Flathead River below, but thank goodness he didn't plow all the way through. He was driving very, very slow. But here's the when and where of this one. And for me, it led to another fantastic piece of information, because when I saw that the coroner had to take care of this particular death, I knew there would at least be some information. And sometimes you can even find the coroner's information out online. So you anticipate what questions you need to ask yourself. What happened? What conditions might be contributory? What did the death certificate say? What were the doctor's findings? They might be totally different in terms of how long the doctor had taken care of this person. Were there any other kind of formal investigations? Was there an autopsy? I can tell you right now that even if the autopsy is checked off as a yes, frequently that is not available. But go for it. Try to get it. See what you can do. If it was a suspicious death, there might be an inquest. More often this happened in the late years, beginning about 1880 through about 1970. Was there at least a sheriff's report of type if it's in a rural area? What investigatory kind of documents could we get? That needs to be a question, and one that later on you highlight so that you go after the next set of documents. Remember, if it was an industrial accident, even if it says that it was the guy's fault, the guy's own fault because he stood underneath a lump of coal and it dropped on him, there may be documents available for the family. Beginning in the 1930s, industrial accidents in all states were investigated by a separate party, by a U.S. government party. And so you will need to look for those documents in some other places, but they are available. Remember, if the information is sensitive and you're anticipating those what questions, what information could there be and how far could you go to get that information if you needed it? Would you go all the way to an FOI, a Freedom of Information, like a reporter would? I don't know. But you need to think about it. This is what I found about my grandpa. I found the coroner's register. This is a little different from a coroner's jury. Please remember that there are different kinds of documents. There can be a coroner's jury, which actually investigates a death and may recommend an inquest or not. There can be a simple register, and that's what this one is. It says that my grandpa was 83. It does not fill in the description of him, and so I might go after that on something else, and I might say, you know, I at least have information about my grandpa from his World War I draft. And even though it won't tell me that his hair was gray at this point, I do have a descriptor of some place that tells about how tall he was, his height, and his weight at that point, and so on. So I've got at least one document somewhere. This tells you a little more about the name and place where the death occurred on US Highway 2, 3.5 miles west of the Continental Divide near Essex. Okay, so now I've got an identifier. I'm close. And the name of the nearest relative who came forward, who was in, it said in his billfold to contact his son, John D. Lee, who was at Seeley Lake. And so they did that. They put in where my grandpa was buried and the description of the personal effects. The cash he had on him, $534. He liked to carry cash. His Timex, his personal papers, his billfold, and clothing. And they did not hold an autopsy. They didn't think that was necessary. I found a really neat thing when I looked at that document, however. I found a thing that was signed by my uncle, by John D. Lee's son, saying, this is what I got. I did get the Timex. I got the watch. I got $534.65 cash, the billfold, the papers, and his clothing. And it's signed by them. Wow, is that cool or what? And I got my clue here. Wagner and Campbell Incorporated happens to be a funeral home. So that must be who handled the body. And that indeed is what I found out later. Now, on to death certificate analysis using your questions. Remember, your goal is to be able to self-direct to more information by asking carefully constructed questions that they might be very, very simple at the beginning. Until you analyze what you find and you go back even later on and you make connection. But my ultimate goal for me was to quit whining and stop saying, I've looked everywhere. I learned that early on, actually, in a college research class, because we're not looking for single answers. We are going to look for connected data that we find ourselves connected to information. And as we write our conclusions, other questions come to mind for us that we want answered. Thus, we become self-directed. Here's what you need. You need a copy of the death certificate. Never, never, never the original, and never a copy you might accidentally write on. Please don't write your questions on the death certificate. Put it to the side. You're going to come back to this one. It won't be a one-off, believe me. You need a workspace template you can work on. And like I say, I use two 11 by 17 sheets of paper that I tape together. You can tape other kinds of paper together that have lines on them. I don't care what, but make it so that you can fold it up and keep it temporarily until the information you find is used up. By used up, I mean, put all the information into your database. Make sure that you've got the death certificate scanned and digitized someplace in your files, because chances are someone else is going to ask you for that copy, and you may have paid quite a bit of money for it. So make sure that you've got more than one copy. I also like to take those death certificates, anything that I've scanned or digitized, put them on a thumb drive along with other family information and give it to people for a Christmas present, because no, I'm not going to run off a copy for them, but I will give them digitized copies for a Christmas present. You're going to want to look at all the questions you analyzed for all the people on the death certificate, not just the decedent. Does it look like that person had a doctor? Many times we find out people didn't have a doctor. And so the doctor that signs the certificate, other than being able to give a diagnosis of death, doesn't have a clue about the person. So look carefully so you can see whether or not that's a family doctor or whatever. I want you to visualize it. Make a physical template. I use those blank sheets. I have lots of room to load my questions around the edges. I use my little note cards if I need to. But you make your own template. Come on in and show me what you made, because I'm delighted by what people show me, unless they've written on the death certificate, then I'm not so delighted. But make your workspace big enough so you can scribble your questions at the side of the certificate that you're analyzing. Put those questions down. Later on, if you're looking back at this workspace and trying to figure out what you did, you're going to be sorry that you didn't take the time to do all the questions. So here's my dad. And if you notice, I've put that death certificate on the page, and over on the left side, I was actually able to just put a little note there for you that says, put your questions here on the side. No, that's not an 11 by 17 because I had to fit it all the way down onto this little projector. And so take it from me, the questions would be much bigger, but I would look right at the beginning and do my who questions, because there's lots of things there. The who is number one. And who was he? He was a truck driver for a heating oil company. And The informant, wow, look at this. It wasn't a family member. It was the King County Medical Examiner person. They have a number out there. He died in 1969, by the way. So we know that 69 with that number indicates the year. That's in Washington. So you'll find more who down at the bottom in the form of the certifier, G. Bruce Hopkins, MD, who was an assistant pathologist and who looked and said, this person expired from what the ambulance crew said, that he came alive briefly in the ambulance and then they could not revive him. And so you'll see those things and you'll see who the registrar is at the bottom, the funeral director, all of that. In the middle, you'll see a very thorough diagnosis. Myocardial ischemia. He had just loaded a huge barrel of oil. He'd helped his boss load a barrel of oil, and the stress probably didn't help at all, the stress of doing that. He could not breathe, and when they looked, it looked like severe heart disease because they could tell that from the autopsy. Yes, there was an autopsy. They were careful to stamp in there in part 2 that he died without medical attendance because he'd actually died before the ambulance crew could get there. So I got lots of information out of this. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a homicide or a suicide, and it wasn't undetermined. Wasn't an injury or anything like that. So I could begin to look at this and say, wow, my dad didn't have a regular doctor. I knew that. Didn't really believe in them. But here's who took care of him. Here's what happened. And I knew that my aunt got him buried. So before you begin, notice that I showed you bunches of things on that last certificate about my dad that had blanks. I always write a question for any blank left unanswered. I want to know why. If nothing else, I'll put in, why is this blank left unanswered if it doesn't seem evident? On my dad's, it did because they did an autopsy. It was a pathologist who did it. He didn't have a doctor. But if I looked to see the informant, as I did on my mom's, and I discovered that is my sister, then I recognized her name. I could ask her more about what she remembers when she had to go in and provide the information. So you need to find his or her role in the community, because if I'm looking at that pathologist and I wanted to know more, and by the way, I tried to get that autopsy, I could not. All they had for me was the information that the autopsy had been performed. But again, I didn't ask till 20 years later. Was the informant an official? Did someone else later try to complete the information? One of my questions is, do I have news articles about the death? There was a little news article about my dad dying. It was maybe 2 inches in the newspaper, just saying that an unidentified man had died at a service station. But I knew from the address that referred to my dad. Yes, I have that. I have the obituary. And I managed to get the little mortuary death notice. I don't think I can have enough information. If the informant was an official, like a doctor or a hospital registrar or a pathologist, you can find out if there are more records. If you don't ask questions, you're not going to find any answers. So ask even more questions. When you finish with a certificate, when you finish looking at it, ask yourself, what have I missed? Write that question down at the bottom and come back to review it. So here's my dad. What the heck happened? He died without medical attendance. And my immediate questions to myself, thinking of you guys as you're looking at this document, is, was it an injury? Why was there an autopsy? I need to find the obituary. So if I don't ask questions, I write things for myself to do. I write a list. If you're not a questioner, then be a list maker. You'll find that they collide, by the way, and they fit together beautifully. That is, being a questioner and a list maker. So Mrs. Blanche McKee Gibson died on 11/23/1918 of post-influenzal pneumonia. And remember, this was during the time of the first great epidemic that we had in the United States in 1918. And this is sad. She was 35 years old. The certificate looks different in Montana at that point because they're asking for the occupation. They are asking for the name of the father and his birthplace. So you'll frequently get that on older certificates, and the birthplace of the mom too. And then who filled it out? Informant, Mrs. McKee. Wow. I wonder if that person was related to Blanche McKee Gibson. She was buried at Highland, and the undertaker was W.H. George. So I got some pretty valuable information off this, and so did her father-in-law, the illustrative Paris Gibson. He would not die until 1919, but this was his actually granddaughter-in-law, because the next day, one day after his wife died, Paris Douglas Gibson Jr. died of the same thing. They were stuck out at the ranch, managed to get the influenza, and then got the terrible, terrible pneumonia that followed it for so many young people. They died a day apart. They were buried on the same day. And this was a very, very sad day for these two families. Sometimes you'll find things like this. So look beyond the one certificate, especially if you're dealing with epidemics. I can't wait to see the information that we finally get from 2020 death certificates. And it says here, Paris D. Gibson and his wife died. Grandson of city's founder, daughter of Eden Stockman are influenza victims. And it tells you a little bit about it in the November 25, 1918 Great Falls Tribune. Influenza and the pneumonia that followed it kind of burst on the scene in Great Falls and in most of Montana at the 1st of October. But we get the first deaths, huge bunch of them actually, on October 8 in 1918. So you'll find pretty neat things. Now, if we were doing these, we would place a copy of their death certificates probably side by side at the center of a workspace. Use those small pieces of tape to hold the death certificate top and bottom. Leave spaces. Begin with demographics. Be deliberate. Don't skip. If you want to go to your one question, I'm going to discourage it. I'm going to say that, you might glance at it and say, oh, goody, I know that. But if you do that, you're going to fixate and say, oh, goody, I got the answer that I wanted. And this is your opportunity to learn about place, where more documents and goodies might be found. Like Paris Gibson Jr. and his wife lived in Cascade County. So that's where I'm going to look for those wills, for those inventories, because they maybe didn't have a will, but they would have an inventory of all the materials and the things that they left at their ranch. And so I'm going to want to know enough about Cascade County to know who has the goodies I want in the form of the next documents. So begin with the demographics, go through the people, go through the background, go through finding out who their parents were. And by the way, if you looked back on this, it says that the name of the father for Paris Gibson Jr. was Philip Gordon. Well, the person who filled this in just assumed people would know that Philip Gordon's last name was Gibson. Be prepared for stuff like that. There's going to be demographic information, the state, the county, the village, the city, the street address, or the place, 7 miles south of Cascade or something like that as an address. The hospital or institution, name of it and the length of stay, sometimes the usual residence. And I've given these all to you today because if I were me and I were doing cards, I might put some of this stuff on the card, or even take time to tape this information to a card, because it would give you some ideas about what demographics should be there. and what demographics are missing later on. We find that they're pretty good with demographic information because a lot of that demographic information still directly in the form of reports from the state to the U.S. Census Bureau. And by the way, all of these questions that states thoughtfully answered on their death certificates actually came as a result of the U.S. Census Bureau asking those questions on their mortality schedules from 1850 through about 1890, before they felt that they had a pretty good handle on who died of what, when, and what states should be doing to record this information. So here's a certificate of death for my uncle Orrin Lee, who died sadly at the age of 45. He'd been in Fort Harrison Hospital for 153 days, suffering as a result of extreme heart problems. And those heart problems are serious in my family. And so we look very carefully at these. Actually, when I look at my DNA and my brother's DNA and relatives and have it examined by a person in the know, we have about a 66% chance of having heart problems just as a result of our DNA background on my grandfather's side. So here's my questions. Where did he live prior to death? Well, he was living over in Big Fork, actually. Why would he be at Fort Harrison? And what was his full name? Was he married? Well, it doesn't say. I'll tell you yes. What was his occupation? Did he serve in the military in World War II? Wow. Yes, I found a neat thing about him that he served in the military. Now take it, remember that this man has probably always had a heart problem. It just didn't show until about the age of 35 to 40. And then he started having congestive heart failure due to aortitis. I think I spelled it correctly. And between the time they found it and the time that he died, it was 5 months. They just couldn't do a lot about it. But what I discovered about this uncle, as I was doing this very thing that I'm sharing with you today, was his personal background. And I had to take a second look. Here's my second look about my Uncle Orrin. Father's name and birthplace. Were they left blank? No, they weren't. Who was the informant? Well, the informant, by the way, was Elvira Lee down here, and that was his wife, Elvira Lee, and she was his wife. But if you didn't know, you would have to investigate that. What's another way to get father's name if you're not sure? Well, check out the school censuses. Don't forget those. Don't forget the U.S. censuses. Other kinds of information. You may find out, as my grandpa Oscar did, that his father's name was rather obscure because he was an illegitimate child. So just remember all of these personal history questions, the date of birth and place, the age, the occupation, dad and mom's names, because that'll take you backward. I happen to have an informant, a person in Michigan. It said Mrs. John Nickel for my great grandmother's death. Mrs. John Nickel was the informant. Well, I was pretty confused because I knew that her daughter was living around her. So who was this Mrs. John Nickel? I had to do significant work to find out that yes, it was her daughter, who had just gotten married the previous week and was into using her new husband's name, not her own. But it could be a daughter. Is it a neighbor, a friend, the fan club that we talk so much about? So here's my uncle. Did he live on a farm or in a town? He was on a farm, actually his dad's farm, and he died at that Vet Admin Center Hospital in Helena. So look at the medical certification of death and make your questions here. How long did the doctor attend this person? What was his or her immediate cause of death? What were the contributing factors? Sometimes that's going to be the contributing factors are going to be on the death certificate. As a result, again, of helpful information from the National Institutes of Health, needing to know what contributing factors are. It is a reportable thing in all states in the United States today. What were other conditions? Was there an autopsy? Was it due to an external cause? Did they have a car accident? Were they murdered? Was this person suspected of suicide? What if there was an injury? Where did it happen and when? And those signatures that you get. And so you don't see a lot here again, because they'd had him for more than 150 days. So they put in congestive heart failure and just said, we've seen this guy for 5 months, because he didn't have a doctor before that. Yeah, he did not have a doctor. So all they could do is say that there was a VA doctor, Froner, who attended his death and said what it was to the best of his ability, and no autopsy was performed. So last but not least, we've talked before about how valuable funeral home records can be, and my video on that is out at our Great Falls YouTube site if you want to see that again, because boy, I found easily 18 to 19 kinds of information, depending on the person, that the funeral home director had put down, and you wouldn't find any of that information on a death certificate. It was very valuable to me. So get the funeral home record. Be nice, be polite, be firm, get the paperwork available, and frequently it's going to answer even more questions. And frankly, every single time you get one of these documents, they generate even more questions if you are into asking the questions and getting the answers from them. So I was satisfied at the beginning because I'd found Uncle Orrin. I'd found him birthed. I'd found him married. I buried him. And I wrote a brief statement about his life. He was my dad's younger brother. I didn't think about his military service, but later on, I heard that he'd been in the military. And so I searched for his obituary and found some more wonderful things. I found an application for a headstone. And I found out that he served in Company L in the 87th, not the 89th Infantry, in the 10th Mountain Infantry Division. Holy smokes. My uncle served in a very, very famous today group of men. These people were some of what we call the 1st Special Forces. Wow, hot dog. And when I went back and looked at his gravesite, wow, yep, there it is. Exactly what he served in. And because early on I had been naive and I hadn't realized, I thought that MT stood for Montana. Well, it was the 87th Montana Infantry 10th Mountain Division. Wow. So I learned a bundle. I have not been able to find any military keepsakes, unfortunately, and his wife is dead. But I struck gold otherwise. Just the other night, I found the regimental history, and so I've got it pulled over onto my computer, and I really do like to read paper, but it's a little long, so I'm busy hunting through there and seeing what that little company, L, was doing in this war and trying to get the timeline of where he served and when. I do know, by the way, that he served in Italy and at least. And so that's going to be one of the first places that I look. I'll get everything I can about him. In conclusion, recognize that returning to look at a certificate at intervals is part of this strategy. It's part of the questioning strategy. When you return to look at the certificate, you're going to want that big form that you folded up and placed in a file. So make a date with yourself to return for a second look. because if you've been consistently applying the question scaffold, then you're getting better. You're going beyond the simple questions you've asked at the beginning. You've grown in your skills and you're busy jotting things down. So as you increase your use of questions, you also improve your powers of analysis, and you're going to find more answers. And I admit it, you're going to find even more questions that you can ask. And sometimes, you'll say, wow, why did I do this? Now I have these questions to do. But as we all know, genealogy is kind of an addiction, and it's a pretty neat thing as we find out about these people who are ancestors in our lives. So use the question scaffold to methodically analyze documents. Use the question cards, because they'll remind you to be thorough about the types of questions you should be asking, not just the simple ones. Write the questions on the workspace template so you can go back and look at where you were at one point. Draw your arrows to the answers. Write a brief summary. Mine are usually down in the corner, written on the diagonal, of things that I found significant at that point. And believe me, when I've gone back and looked, I've said, oh, even though I wrote the question, I missed using the answer in my summary. Use the question scaffold and looking back at your analysis until it's totally second nature to you. And then I'm going to tell you, you'll use it, or you'll use something that works for you and hopefully increases your skills, because you are not just trying to find a single piece of information. You are trying to increase your skills and increase your total background piece of information about the people you are studying. So each type of document comes with its own unique set of questions. There's another, I still use a question scaffold when I look at an inventory, or at a will, or a probate, or even an inquest. I'll use it and use the basic format for questions, put it down on a form, and recognize that if it's more than one page, I need to be using sticky notes instead. I found them quite helpful for anything beyond a page one. It's going to come with its unique set of questions, so be thorough, analyze, write your questions, and learn and grow as you look at each death certificate.